Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. The theme for today's discussion is rebellion against God. With me is P. Sufenas Virius Lupus, who is a practicing polytheist and a scholar. He is the author of The Serpent Path Primer, as well as Ephesia Grammata, Ancient History and Modern Practice. He is also known by his legal name of Phillip Bernhardt-House. He teaches in the Social Sciences Department of Skagit Community College in Whidbey Island, Washington. Welcome, Lupus.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you too. When we think about rebellion against God, it's important to note that throughout human history and mythological history, there have been many rebellions against the dominant deities of any given era.
Exactly. I think when people hear a phrase like that, they immediately think Satan. Yeah. Right, and of course that's what we understand in a modern, dominantly monotheistic culture.
Certainly, Satan is archetypal,
right?
In that regard, and I do want to talk about Satan, but the tradition of rebellion against the ruling deity goes back to the very earliest myths, does it not?
Yes. Often the cosmogonic myths of the Greeks that you find in Hesiod and a number of other ancient Greek authors indicates that there were successions of different generations, or you could even say dynasties to a certain extent, of deities at different times, and the next one always comes in by overthrowing the previous.
Most people, for example, probably understand about the Titans and then the Olympian gods. The Olympian gods supposedly overthrew the Titans, but even before the Titans, there were other deities.
Precisely. In the version we have from Hesiod, it essentially says that there was Gaius and Ouranos, earth and heaven, and they had three different sets of children. First, they had the 100-handed, the Hecaton Chires, and then they had the elder Kyklopes, the Cyclopses, and then they had the Titans. And Ouranos did not like the 100-handed or the one-eyeds, so he stuck them in Tartaros, and that made Gaia angry.
What is Tartaros?
So Tartaros is a number of things. It seems to actually be a being in some of the early Greek cosmogonies, but it's mostly identified with kind of a place of punishment in the other world.
Okay.
The very worst offenders end up there. You got to be a really bad human to end up in Tartaros.
Or a Cyclops.
Right, or a Cyclops or a Titan.
I see.
Right. So he put them into Tartaros.
Ouranos.
Yes, Ouranos did
Ouranos,
that. And
yes.
And that made Gaia angry. And so she
After all, these are her children.
Exactly. And he thought they were ugly, and she said, it doesn't matter, they're still my children. They're still, the siblings of the Titans. So she ended up creating a sickle with the help of the Cyclopses and the 100-handeds, gave it to her youngest child, who was Kronos, of the Titans, and said, go overthrow your father. And then he castrated him, cast him down from the heavens. The castrated genitals fell into the ocean and created Aphrodite. And then Kronos became the reigning deity. But then, of course, there were prophecies that someone would overthrow him, so he started eating his children. And then Rhea, his wife, who was an earth goddess, then in her time decided, okay, this is not right. He's eating all the kids. That just isn't right. So the last child was Zeus. She substituted a rock, put that in swaddling clothes and handed it to Kronos, and he ate it. And then Zeus was raised in a cave in Crete, by various different figures, and then he eventually, with the help of the Hundred-Handed and others, then overthrew Kronos.
So what we have here are two earth goddesses, Gaia and Rhea, who are instrumental through subterfuge, I suppose, in overthrowing Ouranos and Kronos, who were at the time the kings of the gods.
Right, and the kings of the heavens.
The kings of the heavens.
And that's an interesting thing in and of itself. In many Near Eastern cultures and Egyptian culture, the royal figure of the heavens is usually a she. It's the queen of heaven,
yes.
Inanna or Isis or whoever it happens to be. So this is an interesting thing that the earth goddesses are always getting frustrated, often with their husbands, for mistreating their children.
And you have this polarity between earth goddess and sky god.
Right. And it's an interesting thing because you get in Egyptian again, so the main heavenly goddess would be Nut, and then the earth god that was her consort was Geb. But then in the Greek tradition, it's usually sky god, earth goddess, although there are some sky goddesses as well.
But in both of these cases of Gaia overthrowing Ouranos and Rhea overthrowing Kronos, the idea is that it's the actual behavior of the sky god that has become so offensive to the earth goddess that she feels a need to plot against him.
Precisely, yeah. And so then we've got what is supposed to be the current generation with Zeus. And if anybody knows anything about Zeus, it's that his behavior is not exactly nice in many ways. He has more illegitimate children than you can shake a whole bundle of sticks at. One of the things that's very interesting about him, though, in comparison to his father and grandfather, is that there are repeated prophecies about this child from this mother might overthrow you, and he's always doing something to avoid it or to stop it. And so, for example, one case was a prophecy either by Themis in some texts or Prometheus in others, that the child of Thetis, who was a sea titaness, if she had a child by either Zeus or Poseidon, it would overthrow Zeus. So the way that he got out of that was to marry her off to the mortal Peleus. And at their wedding feast, Eris threw a golden apple in.
Oh, the famous golden apple.
Exactly, and it started the Trojan War.
Yeah.
And the interesting thing about that is that the child from Thetis and Peleus was Achilles, and the Trojan War in and of itself brought the heroic age to an end. So it wasn't a kind of cosmic age-ending or world-ending event. It was an earthly one. The child of Thetis, no matter what, was going to be something quite amazing. And that's not the only story like that where Zeus averts a potential usurper.
Well, you have written extensively about a potential interest in the earth goddess Demeter,
right,
to overthrow Zeus.
Right. This is something that came to my attention a few years ago. I heard a presentation by Sarah Iles Johnston, who is a classicist. She writes a lot about Orphic things. She has a wonderful book called Hecate Sotera, that's about the goddess Hecate and the Chaldean oracles. And what she was presenting on was an idea that's found in a few other scholars as well, interestingly female scholars, that ultimately part of the Homeric hymn to Demeter, which is the oldest version of the Demeter and Persephone story, that maybe there is an indication of this type of thing going on there. So the way that it works is this. Oftentimes people look at that story and they say it's a metaphor for seasons. That Demeter is sad that Persephone is away, and so that's why we have winter.
Yes.
Interestingly, that interpretation doesn't come about until much later. And in the text of the Homeric hymn itself, it doesn't happen. So Persephone gets stolen away to Hades, by Hades. And incidentally, Persephone is the daughter of Demeter by Zeus. So she's upset because nobody cleared this with her. Demeter doesn't like that her daughter has been married away. So she goes down to earth and is in mourning. Seasons are fine. Nothing has changed there. She eventually comes to the site of Eleusis, sits down by the side of a well, and meets the daughters of the local king, and they say, "Oh, well, we're in need of a wet nurse. Would you mind?" And so she ends up getting that job, and she has a child, the king's child, which is called Demophoon. And she decides that she's going to immortalize him by feeding him ambrosia and then placing him in the fire to burn away his mortal flesh.
A ritual known to her because she is a goddess.
Exactly. Of course, Isis does something similar in the later Greco-Egyptian versions of the Isis and Osiris myth. It's something that occurs in a number of places. There's even some versions that Achilles had his own permeable flesh, you might say, burned away in a similar manner. When Metanera, the queen of Eleusis, walks in on this ritual and is horrified
to see her baby in the fire.
Exactly. That disrupts the ritual. Screaming mothers, that tends to put a stop to things. And at that point, Demeter says, "Oh, you don't know what you just did. You're going to be sorry about this." It's at that point that she retires into a temple and the famine comes upon the earth. And the only reason that then the gods come to settle with her about it is not because all these people are dying, but because there's no grain offerings for them in rituals and libations and so forth. So then they send Rhea to intervene with her, and then she agrees, okay, we'll come to this arrangement of she's with me for part of the year. So what Sarah Iles Johnston and other scholars have said about this is maybe she was immortalizing him not just as a surrogate child after having lost Persephone, maybe it is to dethrone Zeus. And I find that to be a very, very, very intriguing idea. And I've explored it further in some of my own practices and research and so on. And there's a great deal about what we know of the rituals at Eleusis, which point to something of this sort.
Well, the idea of dethroning Zeus is intriguing to me because Zeus is a god of the Indo-European tradition from the Aryan peoples. In India, there is a comparable tradition, and the god there is Indra. The Vedic god is very much like Zeus.
Yes.
And one finds that Zoroaster, who was a religious reformer of the Vedic tradition or the Aryan Indo-European tradition, when he wrote, he did a kind of reversal. He maintained that the great god was now Ahura Mazda, and Ahura was a demon. An Ashura in the Vedic tradition. So basically he said, okay, from now on the demons are going to be the gods are going to be the demons. He did a complete reversal, and it was a religious reform because he felt that the religions of the time, according to a recent interview that I did on the subject, had become corrupted.
Right. So this is, and I think even apart from the wider point there, this is often something that happens, that with great social changes and religious changes, the old order gets subverted. in the transfer from polytheistic systems to monotheistic, the many gods often become demons. Occasionally, in certain special cases, they might become saints in Christianity, but for the most part, in monotheistic religions, they don't fare well. So, yeah, it's a theme that comes up so often in so many different cultural traditions that I suspect there's something to it that needs to be taken into account, just in terms of understanding eschatology in these particular cultures.
Now let's talk about Satan, the great literary epic describing Satan's rebellion against God, of course, is Milton's poem, Paradise Lost.
Right.
It's considered one of the greatest works ever written in the English language.
Right.
It goes back to the Renaissance. And Milton was a devout Christian. It was his intention in writing the poem to, as he put it, explain the ways of God to men.
Right. Right.
And it was his way of justifying the Christian theology.
Right.
And even going deeper maybe to the problem of evil itself, which is a real problem in Christian theology. How can, if God is omnipotent and God is all good, why is evil, why does God allow evil in the world?
Exactly.
That's the problem. But literary critics have looked at Milton's great poem, and the thing that comes up over and over again in generation after generation is that Satan is the hero of this poem. There's something ennobling about his rebellion against Yahweh.
Right. And to kind of step back just ever so slightly from that, the kind of Luciferian trend. I mean, Lucifer literally in Latin means a light bearer.
Now, Lucifer is often syncretized, to use a word you like, with Satan, but they are distinct figures, I believe.
Right, and even in some medieval Latin hymns, Jesus is called Lucifer because he certainly brings light to the world as well.
Yes.
But in this kind of strain of Luciferian philosophy or mythology or however you want to understand it, that's often the thing. The person who brings light and or knowledge is punished for it. So we have that in Prometheus, of course. We have it certainly in Gnostic interpretations of certain strains of Gnosticism with the Lucifer figure, whether it's the serpent in the Garden of Eden or a Luciferian or even satanic figure more generally. In fact, if I remember correctly, it's the Cainite Gnostics who kind of say that all of the bad guys of the Bible are actually the good guys. So Cain was the good guy, not Abel.
I see.
And then something that became of interest in the last 10 years again, then Judas is the important figure rather than Jesus because he accomplishes the betrayal. And just kind of from you might say, narrative viewpoint, somebody had to be the one to do the bad thing. And so it all gets heaped onto Judas, when in reality, if this is how it was intended to be always, and the way that it happened was in God's plan, then how can you blame him for what happened?
Well, that's part of the paradox of the problem of evil.
Right, exactly.
If Satan is such an evil figure and yet is part of God's creation, then Satan is doing God's will.
Right, exactly. And you get some of that in medieval witchcraft texts, for example, which essentially say that witches are able to do the things that they do because God allows Satan to give them these powers. And so I've always found that, not being a monotheist myself, a very kind of mental gymnastics way to explain, theodicy, the problem of evil. Why is there suffering in the world? Why do bad things happen to good people? I find, speaking of that title, When Bad Things Happen to Good People, Rabbi Harold Kushner's book on that, I personally think is one of the most interesting books of its kind that's come out in the late 20th century, because ultimately the conclusion that he comes to after looking at the story of Job is that the Jewish God, or the monotheistic God as he understands it, is all-loving but not all-powerful, and that's the only way that you can explain it.
Okay, well, if from the point of view of a pantheist, I should think that the problem of evil isn't a real problem at all, because the pantheon, or a polytheist, such as yourself, the pantheon includes every type of god and demon all together, so that you don't start out with the problem of saying that the deity or the Godhead is only good and all good, pure goodness, which is how the English word God is derived from the word good.
Exactly. Yeah, deities have different sides to their personalities. So you might get the good side if everything goes okay, and sometimes you get the bad side, or even the harsh side, the tough love side. You might go through a horrible experience in your life, but you go through it in order to have something useful come out of it. In this way, many modern polytheists are now talking about this, and the only language we have to talk about it, or not the only language, but the best and most well-known language to talk about it, comes again from Christian theology, St. John of the Cross, the dark night of the soul. There are polytheist precursors to that kind of idea, that there can be difficult experiences up to and including the lack of presence and connection with a deity that you go through, that kind of force you to refocus on your practice and keep doing it, rather than losing all faith and giving it up, in order to, you get through that experience, and then you come out of the other side of it stronger and closer to the deity.
Well, I get a sense when we talk about rebellion against the deity, a rebellion against God, that there's a kind of almost eternal conflict between the notion of the earth goddess, the earth mother, and the sky god. Yeah,
and it's interesting to highlight that again, because in the Egyptian system, which always emphasizes ma'at, right? Cosmic order, cosmic justice, the way things are supposed to be.
Truth,
yes, exactly. That you don't have that conflict. In Irish mythology, which has a concept called Fir, which means truth, justice, and cosmic order, you don't have a conflict between earth deities and sky deities. But you have it in Greek, and you have it in a number of other cultures. So, it's kind of a wider question of maybe if that comes from Indo-European or what, but given that we are living in a society now that has been under patriarchal and kyriarchal rule.
Kyriarchal meaning?
So kind of the entire system of designating some people as better than others, usually favoring men who are powerful, coming from the Greek word kyrios, which means Lord.
Okay.
Right? So in those critiques of culture and of religion and so forth, the male domination really is a problem. And it's something that has been endlessly repeated throughout society at every level. And so the feminist critiques of religion now, and the suggestion that goddesses need to come back, that's an important corrective. And I think it could even go one step further. Not only do goddesses need to come back, they need to come back and bring their armies with them, so to speak.
Well, as a polytheist, aren't you implicitly making a statement of rebellion against the god of monotheism?
I would say yes and no. I don't accept that the gods of monotheism, because I think they're separate, are singular or all-powerful or the creators. I acknowledge their existence. I even occasionally engage in cultus to some of them. But all of them, with the exception of the Christian God, which is a special case, were all head of pantheon deities. Allah was the head of the Arabic polytheist pantheon.
Yes.
And then the Hebrew God, the singular Hebrew God, which was syncretized with Yahweh, El, and at least one of the Baals.
Yes, the original phrase Elohim was a plural.
Exactly, right. So that deity was a kind of head of pantheon deity.
The head of the heavenly hosts.
Exactly, yeah. And that's the Greek and Greco-Egyptian way to refer to that deity is Yao Sabaoth. And Sabaoth is exactly as it is in Hebrew. So that deity is a deity that I have dealings with on occasion. I understand him to be the Hebrew God. I have Jewish ancestry myself on both sides of the family, so he's important as an ancestral deity.
I see.
He's not my main deity. I have even been known on occasion to make prayers to Allah, the head of the Arabic pantheon. So I don't negate the existence of those deities. I just see them as plural and not the end-all be-all.
I see. Well, we're out of time. It goes quickly when you're having fun.
It does.
P. Sufenas Virius Lupus, thank you so much for being with me.
Thank you for this opportunity. It's a joy.
And thank you for being with us.